Has everyone voted? Mr. Clerk, please close the board and tally the vote. By 45 yes, 2 no, and 92 present, you have established a quorum. A gentleman from St. Louis County.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The next order of business is House Bills for Perfection. House Substitute for House Committee Substitute, House Bill 543, House Substitute, House Committee Substitute, House Bill 738, and House Committee Substitute, House Bill 137. We'll move to the informal calendar, and I now ask you to recognize the gentleman from Cole concerning House Committee Substitute to House Bill 557 and 560.
Gentleman from Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that House Bill 557 be ordered, perfected, and printed.
The gentleman from Cole has moved that House Bill 557 be ordered, perfected, and printed. Gentleman from Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that House Committee Substitute for House Bills 557 and 560 be adopted.
The gentleman from Cole has moved that House Committee Substitute for House Bill 557 and 560 be adopted. Gentleman from Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that the title for House Committee Substitute for House Bills 557 and 560 be agreed to.
The gentleman from Cole has moved that the title for House Committee Substitute House Bill 557 and 560 be agreed to. Discussion on the title. Seeing none, all those in favor of approving the title will signify by saying aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. You have approved the title. Gentleman from Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This bill deals with what was Section 210-211, which exempted all residential care facilities, which are care facilities for children of between 18 and birth, actually. If they were managed by a religious organization, there was no supervision. There was no background checks. There was no right to go in and check on the children. There was no requirement to keep medical records. There was no right to go in and have eyes on the children. And there was absolutely no control over these homes. And these homes, all you had to say that it was a religious organization, you were religious. And you couldn't even check into it. They were a recognized religious organization. And I assure you that if saying I am religious makes you religious, then we have a lot of ministers out here have misguided us because they've told us we've got to do a lot more than just say you're religious. Well, what happened was Missouri and South Carolina were the only two states that allowed this. And these places charge anywhere from $40,000 to $70,000 and can have a lot of children in them. What happened was there were people who came here and they were truly not religious people. They set these homes up in 501c3s, and we had some horrible, horrible results happen. I don't know if you've seen anything in St. Louis Star and Kansas City. St. Louis Post had them this week. Our Attorney General has just filed 100 some charges last week on one of the homes, and another one they're dealing with this week. But we had testimony at the hearings, and these hearings started by last November already, had long hearings by Children's and Family Committee, and Sheila Solon and Kerry Engel Representative Engel were on those committees, and they spearheaded a large hearing. And we heard testimony from kids from all over the United States, and we heard them at our hearings here too, who had been in these schools where they had been raped, they had been forced to eat their own vomit because they would throw up. They had been taking their medicines away from them because they didn't believe in psychiatric drugs or drugs for mental conditions. We had kids where they left and committed murder because their drugs had been taken away from them. We had kids who got raped. We had kids who had to stand at the wall for 10 to 12 hours. And if you've just seen what our Attorney General just filed, I mean, there's a huge number of cases, and that was for the last 3 years. And these kids are in these homes, and they're not the angels going there to start with. They've had trouble at home. Their parents are sending them there, and their parents, in good faith, relied upon these homes to take care of their children. But if they would call home to their parents, their phone calls were supervised. So they couldn't say anything. If they did say, the home would just say, oh, they're lying. And the parents had trouble with these kids. So it wasn't necessarily parents abandoning their kids. They, in faith, relied upon these organizations to do good things. Well, we've seen all these charges come up. And after they had the hearing in November, they came to me and asked me if I would have an interest in working with them on a bill. Now, I have great respect for these religious organizations. I believe that spirituality can change children and change people more than medicine alone can. And that spiritual training that these organizations did for these kids made a lot of good, and there are a lot of good ones out there. But the trouble is, with no supervision, the bad ones are going to destroy the reputations of the good ones, or worse, they're going to cause more regulations. I met with them, and I drafted a bill that would protect the religious integrity of these homes, but also try to protect the safety of the children. My bill is not a licensing bill. It doesn't give the state the right to run and override them. It is a notification bill. First, it lets you notify that they are there. They have to give you certain information: who's there, who owns the place, where they're located, kids there, so we know who's there and that they are an entity. And an ability to say, no, if you don't comply, we can shut you down, but you only have to comply with notification. The second part was background checks. I mean, this bill is only asking you to do what any good businessman would do to start with: background checks. Who can imagine running these homes without doing background checks? But they did, because they were coming here from other states, and they'd be shut down in one state and they'd come here. So it requires background checks. It requires that they do fire and safety inspections. That's not an unreasonable request. It also provides, if we have a reasonable suspicion that a child is being abused, we can go in, the state can go in and get a court order to go in and talk to a child. Otherwise, they had no way to go into these homes. If someone would tell them that this child is in there and said something, there's no way to go in and verify it. In fact, kids were running away. The sheriff was returning them to the home because his deputies were part of security. So it was totally out of control. I mean, I don't even want to go into how horrible, and you'll hear from some of the other people who have heard this, just how bad the conditions were. But this bill doesn't anything that a good businessman would not do. And I also put a paragraph right in the bill to protect the religious curriculum of the school, that the state cannot come in and tell you can't teach about using the Bible and you can't do this. They can't do that. That limits what they can do, but I believe it puts enough limit, and it's a balancing act that it will work. And it has enough balancing act that I have endorsements from the Missouri Baptist Association and Missouri Catholic Conference. So we have both sides of the spectrum looking at the bill and say something needs to be done, and this is a least restrictive way to do it. Mr. Speaker, I would like to offer an amendment at this time, ending in .02H, and move for its adoption.
The gentleman from Cole has moved for the adoption of House Amendment 1. Gentleman from Cole.
Yes, this amendment was a provision that was in the original bill, but I have met with people and expressed the concerns, and I believe they were right, that in doing the background checks, if someone goes on a background check, they have to have, and says you can't work in our homes, they have to have a mechanism to contest that. That's Jameson was the case, and previously, as originally drafted, I don't think it protected due process rights of individuals who the background check would come up with a negative result on. So this actually gives them a 536 hearing for this, and the important part of that is the background checks that we were doing for most of our background checks did not have this provision in it. And so they were doing it by contract, but constitutional, if you're going to put somebody's name on a list and say you're guilty of sexual whatever, and you're on this list, you have a right to contest it. And that's what this amendment does. I want to protect those rights of individuals too, that we just don't randomly say, well, you're not qualified because some other state said you weren't. Because different states have different criteria. Some have preponderance of the evidence, some have reasonable suspicion. The Jameson case was the Missouri Supreme Court's case, says you have to have by the preponderance of the evidence. So this also is giving them a basis for to protect the constitutionality of everybody involved, and I think that it was brought to me and I agreed that it was a necessary fix. I'll be happy to answer any more questions. If not, I'll renew my motion.
Discussion on House Amendment 1. Seeing none, gentleman from Cole, you are recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I close.
The gentleman from Cole has moved for the adoption of House Amendment 1. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. You have adopted House Amendment 1. Further discussion on House Committee Substitute House Bill 557 and 560 as amended. Lady from Jefferson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To inquire of the lady from Jackson, Ingle District.
Lady from Jackson, do you yield?
I do, Mr. Speaker.
Proceed.
Thank you, lady, for the inquiry. You called me in September and told me what you had found because of the articles that were in the Kansas City Star. The hearing that we had subsequently was maybe the worst thing that I've ever heard in my entire life. I have to be honest with you. Even listening to the testimony of the abuse that children have endured was just horrific. And one of the things that came to mind again and again and again was, why did our existing laws not protect these children? Can you speak a little to that?
Sure. Like you said, I found out in September due to some investigative journalism that there was a gaping hole in our child welfare code that allowed any facility or any entity claiming to be of a religious nature to have an exemption from any form of oversight or regulation by the state or by any other governing entity. Because we are one of the only states in the country to have this type of waiver. Facilities and bad actors from all over the country that owned and operated these facilities, once their state legislature became aware of them and strengthened their laws to shut them down, they came to Missouri. They came to Missouri and they recruited across the country to draw families in of teens or younger children that had had a hard time. Maybe they had behavioral issues, maybe they had mental health concerns. For whatever reason, their treatment needs were not being met, and they sent them, I think, most of the time with the full intent of getting a child out of a really desperate situation and getting them the help that they needed. Unfortunately, that trust was completely violated, and these children were tortured. There's really no other way to describe it. The things that have been told to me by survivors across the country through emails and phone calls and videos described rape, described forcing children to have abortions, described stripping children of their dignity and their self-respect, their belief in God, their belief in love, forced children to fight other children, locked children in closets, forced children to stand in manure, and forced children to do hard labor. A lot of the stories I heard were from veterans, people who have served this country, who have fought for this country, and told me that the trauma that they endured at these facilities far supersedes anything that they experienced while fighting for us. I received an email from a woman who said that her husband took his life last summer because the trauma that he experienced at one of these homes, he could not get over. He couldn't get over it. And we talk about mental health in this body all the time and the impact that it has on all of us. And the fact that for whatever reason, these facilities were allowed to operate in this state for as long as they were is a blight on all of us.
Why did nobody believe the children? This is the thing that I keep going. There's something to be said about, we don't know how many of these schools exist. We don't know where they're coming from, but we have hotline calls from some of these children. Some of them were able to escape and say what happened. And why is it that no one believed them? How could, this is the thing, like, I just get furious. I think, how much time do we spend here working on child welfare laws and all of it to be ignored because these are bad kids?
Right.
The testimony that I heard from parents who frankly had no idea what to do. They were at their wits' end. They didn't know how to get to care for their children, and they sent them to these places. And then to hear that they sent their children to be tortured. They spent $40,000, $50,000, mortgaged their homes, emptied their savings, only to have their children victimized. And then when their children did escape and they were reported, those hotline calls went unanswered. And why?
So I think that there's a lot of reasons why, and that was one of the reasons why we held a hearing in the interim in November was to try to find out whether or not that this was one bad facility, one set of bad actors, or whether this was indicative of a systemic problem. Any time that you label a child as bad or troubled, it makes you less likely to believe them when they tell you what's happening to them.
So the kinds of things that you or I, they would have a preponderance of evidence. If I, for example, a child of mine didn't want to get out of bed, and so I dumped the mattress on the floor, or I pulled them on the ground until I broke their wrists, or if I pushed their heads into manure, or I made them eat food after they had vomited it up, there would be a preponderance of evidence found against me, as there should, and the state would remove the children from me.
Right.
But in these situations, that's not what happened, even when there's been credible testimony.
No, that's absolutely right. In fact, we found out with the first case back in September that one of these facilities, they had multiple preponderance of evidence findings against them for sexual abuse, for physical abuse against children, and then they continued to have access to the same children.
Yeah, so the child would be interviewed and then returned.
That's right.
And in the contracts that parents would enter into with these places, they would have no contact with their child, and they would say they're going to lie. And parents who are at their wits' end, I mean, if you could just see the pain of these parents who submitted their children to this thinking they were doing the right thing, that our existing laws are sufficient in many ways when we know about them, if we treat children who are harmed as equally harmed, and that we can then see where these holes are and be filled in. I appreciate the inquiry, lady, and I appreciate the hard work that you and Representative from Cole have done on this since September. It's an ongoing effort. I just am furious. I'm just furious that this happened in Missouri. And on behalf of the state, I apologize, because it's decades that this has gone on. And I'm so grateful that today we're going to say enough and we're going to be moving this bill forward. So thank you, lady.
Thank you.
Further discussion on House Committee Substitute House Bill 557 and 560. Gentleman from Clay.
To inquire of the bill sponsor, please.
Gentleman from Cole, do you yield?
Yes.
Proceed.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. So just a couple of things very quickly. I applaud your effort. I think that you have done a tremendous job in dealing with something that needs to be addressed. I mean, it is a requirement for us to do something to protect these children. I do want to commend you as well in terms of making sure that when we put these mechanisms in place, that there is that sensitivity to what everyone recognizes as an important measure in terms of religious liberties. But at the same time, I will say this as somebody that is a part of one of the groups you mentioned that has openly supported this effort. That there is a reason why we, in our ministries to children, have chosen to go the licensure route, so that we can communicate to those that we serve, as well as the state, that we recognize the tremendous importance of protecting children, to make sure that they are treated the way that they should be treated. They're protected, they're cared for, they're nurtured. And that is something that we believe wholeheartedly in, and I am absolutely supportive of this and am grateful. Can you talk very briefly about the details you put in to just to show that effort on the state's part to respect the religious liberties component? Because I know that there are people that have had questions about that. I'm confident that you've addressed those and am supportive of this, but I thought it might be good to just hit the highlights.
Well, again, the high point is we want to protect these entities that exist in good faith, do great jobs. The provision in there is, got to find it right in here. We had a specific paragraph in here that they do not interfere with. Nothing in the statutes of Missouri shall give any government agency jurisdiction or authority to regulate or attempt to regulate, control, or influence the form, manner, and content of the religious curriculum, program, ministry of a school, or facility sponsored by the church or religious organization. I think that's critical because I actually know some of the children who have been in some of these homes, and I've talked to judges, and they do a great service. But if we don't take care and prevent the bad apples, they're going to ruin it for everyone.
Yes. Well, I think that the language that you have in there absolutely accomplishes what needs to be respected. But at the same time, as important as that is, it is just as important to make sure that our children are safe, that they are loved, that they are protected and nurtured the way that they ought to be. We ought to be doing far better than even what would be required when it comes to our children. And I am so delighted to know that we have this moving forward. I appreciate your work. And Mr. Speaker, thank you for the inquiry. Mr. Speaker, I would just simply say I'm delighted that we're able to move this bill forward. I think it's a great bill. We need to support this, and I would encourage everyone to do so. Thank you.
Further discussion. Lady from St. Louis County.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To speak on the bill, please.
Proceed, lady.
Just a few things. I did hear this bill in hearing, and like the lady from St. Louis County said, it was a difficult morning to hear. And this bill is interesting because we did my seclusion bill this morning. I've heard the same things. And here's what piqued my interest even more and made all my flags go up. When I did the seclusion bill, I heard, well, these are bad kids, Representative. These are bad kids. And I said, okay, so they lose all their civil liberties when they walk in your door? And they didn't answer me. And then I heard this as well. Well, these are bad kids. These are troubled kids. Okay, well, let's help them. Let's not beat them and make it worse. And especially I want to speak to the religious piece because, I realize some of the religious organizations got a little fluttered, which I understand. And your language, gentlemen, protects that piece. But here's what came to me. I thought, my goodness, let's not allow them to use Christ as a beating tool, as a way to get around the law, because that's what these bad actors are doing. There's only 2 states left in the United States. It's us and South Carolina that have this. So they've migrated down. This has been happening really since 1996. And there's been a couple, 2002, 2003, there's been some bills put forward, but they haven't passed. And so we've become the last place where these bad actors can come here and abuse kids in the name of Christ and make $40,000 to $50,000 a year off of them. And I hear all this in the hearing, and I read the Kansas City Star. They did great pieces on it, but I always like to see some evidence. You want to visually see it. And recently, at the Circle of Hope, a former student visited there, and he heard now the gentleman who owns it, who is under indictment of the 101 counts. And if you want to read the 101 counts, come to my office. It's filled with horrible things you don't want to read, but it'll give you the picture. But anyway, he was sitting there with them, and the owner said to one of the girls, "Hey, get up and knock the HELL out of her." And so the guy started his phone because he's like, I can't believe this is happening. And so he recorded it, and I've watched it. And you hear him again say, knock the hell out of her. Basically having a girls' fight club. Not only so do you have all this other horrific evidence, but again, they say, oh, well, they're bad kids. You can't believe them. And that's what's gone on through, 25 years now, where you've had CPS, DSS, every social service is out there, and I know they tried to do their jobs, but they kept blaming this law. Oh, well, we can't do anything because of the religious exemption. And so there is evidence. I've looked at it. You know me. I'll dig in till I can't see anymore, and it's disgusting. And so don't let that religious piece hold you back, because they're doing it the opposite way. They're using Christ to get around this exemption. And then one final thing, I do want to give the Missouri Highway Patrol a lot of credit. They have kept going and going and going on this, and they have helped the AG come out with those indictments last week. So I encourage you to do this. I've kind of blood, sweat, and tears over this one, and I am in favor of it, and I want to thank the 2 sponsors. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Further discussion on House Committee Substitute House Bill 557 and 560 as amended. Gentleman from Cole.
To inquire the bill sponsor.
Gentleman from the other side of Cole, do you yield?
Yes.
Proceed.
Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Thank you.
I want to thank you for bringing this bill forward. We hear a lot of bills on the floor of this House each and every year. There are a few of them that come through here that are so important that we have got to stop and pay attention. The lady from Jackson sent me the email from the Kansas City Star, and I read it, and I was horrified. I was horrified to see what our young people, are the most vulnerable in our society, are living with day after day after day. When you read this, it almost looks like you're reading something from a script of a horror movie, but it's not. It's reality. And coming forward with what you've got, and I co-sponsored your bill, and I would have sponsored it myself if I could have, but these types of legislation are so important for those young people. These families that are turning their children over to somebody in hopes that they're going to do something positive for them and to make a difference in their lives are ruining their lives. As we've heard today, it could cause them to take their lives. So what you have done with this bill is monumental. And I would encourage the entire body to vote for this bill, that we have no votes, no negative votes on this at all. So thank you so much for what you're doing, and I am in full support of your bill.
Well, I thank you, but you have to give credit where it's due. And Representative Salon, Representative Engel, the Children's and Family Committee, they took it by the horns already in November, and they did the hard work. All I did was fine tune and became a mouthpiece. I did have to deal with some of the language and cut out some, because there were some who wanted this bill to be a strict licensing bill. And we also wanted to protect the religious freedom at the same time as to try and hit a balance. And thank you.
Well, and I think that this is really proof that bipartisan legislation can be passed on this floor, and that we can all stand together and do that for the sake of our children. So thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Further discussion. Seeing none, gentleman from Cole, you are recognized to close.
I close.
The gentleman from Cole has renewed his motion that House Committee Substitute House Bill 557 and 560 be adopted. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The House Committee Substitute has been adopted. Gentleman from Cole.
I renew my motion.
The gentleman from Cole has renewed his motion that House Committee Substitute House Bill 557 and 560 as amended be ordered, perfected, and printed. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. You have ordered House Committee Substitute House Bill 557 and 560 perfected and printed. Lady from Wright.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Staying on the same order of business, and now I ask you to recognize the gentleman from St. Louis County for a motion on House Committee Substitute